It was a clear, sunlit morning in southern France when the impossible happened again. The hum of rotors sliced through the still air, drawing eyes upward. Too late. A helicopter, low and fast, skimmed over the horizon and dropped onto the roof of one of the country's most secure prisons. 3 masked figures spilled out, moving with the precision of men who had rehearsed this 100 times before. No words, no hesitation, just the glint of steel and the cold assurance of a plan already in motion. Somewhere deep inside the isolation wing, a man who had once been labeled France's most dangerous prisoner was already standing, ready, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Within minutes, they vanished into the sky, leaving alarms blaring uselessly behind them. It was brazen, it was flawless, and for Pascal Payet, it was only the latest chapter in a life built on defying the very walls meant to contain him. Decades earlier, there had been nothing in Payet's childhood to hint at the notoriety that would follow. Born in the sun-warmed streets of Montpellier in 1963, he was still a boy when his family moved north to Lyon, and later, as a young man, gravitated to the port city of Marseille. It was a place that had long danced with the shadows, narrow streets packed with history, whispers of smuggling in the air, and a criminal undercurrent that lured the restless and ambitious. Marseille's crime scene was not a playground, it was a crucible, and the heat changed people. Petty theft became a test, street fights became lessons. For Pascal, survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant crime. By the late 1980s, the city itself was a boiling point. Unemployment, drug wars, and simmering distrust between the police and entire neighborhoods had carved deep fault lines. For some, these conditions bred desperation. For Pascal, they bred opportunity. Petty jobs turned into armed stick-ups, and before long, his name was carried quietly among Marseille's hardened circles. In 1988, an aggravated assault conviction should have slowed him, but it only set the rhythm for what was to come. 5 years later, he faced criminal conspiracy charges, and each arrest seemed to press him deeper into the folds of organized crime rather than pull him out. His reputation shifted from just another street tough to a man who could be trusted in high-stakes, high-reward jobs. The defining break came in 1997. On an otherwise quiet November day, an armored cash truck rolled out of a bank in Salon-de-Provence. What followed was a storm in broad daylight, a choreographed ambush that cracked the air with automatic gunfire. 3 men executed the hit: Pascal Payet, Eric Alborio, and Michel Valero. One security guard didn't make it home. Witnesses swore Pascal was the one carrying the Kalashnikov, firing point blank without hesitation. The take was big, but the cost was bigger. Violence had elevated him from a known criminal to a national priority target, and soon enough, the nickname began to circulate: Kalashnikov Pat. A year later, in January 1999, after months of eluding police, Pascal was caught in Paris. He was charged with armed robbery, conspiracy, and murder, a trinity of crimes that all but promised he would be locked away for decades. But the state underestimated one thing: Payet didn't see a prison sentence as a wall, he saw it as a challenge. In October 2001, that challenge became a spectacle. Somewhere above Marseille, 2 men posing as aircraft mechanics hijacked a helicopter at gunpoint. The pilot was told exactly where to fly and exactly what would happen if he didn't comply. Minutes later, the rotors churned the air above the walls of Loigny's prison. Guards froze. There was no scheduled arrival. Before anyone could react, 2 armed men dropped into the yard, cutting across the space toward a single cell. Moments later, Pascal Payet and another inmate, Frédéric Impocco, were airborne. No shots fired, no blood spilled, just the impossible unfolding in real time. By afternoon, every major French news outlet had the footage, and by evening, the world knew that France had just witnessed its first helicopter escape. Mpoko was recaptured within a week. Payet wasn't. For over a year, he ghosted through safe houses funded by robberies that police suspected but couldn't prove were his handiwork. Then in 2003, he struck again, but not for himself. At dawn on April 14th, another helicopter landed in the same prison yard. This time, 3 inmates, all former partners in crime, ran to freedom. Pascal had orchestrated every detail from the outside, using the same surgical precision that had freed him 2 years earlier. It was an open taunt to the prison system. Your walls mean nothing to me. 3 weeks later, police cornered him and his crew in a farmhouse stuffed with weapons, cash, and fake documents. The arrests were quiet, almost anticlimactic, but the message lingered. Containment was temporary. Over the next few years, the state tried to make temporary into impossible. Maximum security, constant transfers, solitary confinement, psychological pressure designed to grind down even the most determined escape artist. But Payet wasn't just determined, he was patient. And on Bastille Day 2007, he proved it once more. That morning, while most of France celebrated, 4 men walked casually onto the tarmac at Cannes-Mandelieu Airport. They looked like tourists. One carried a gym bag. Without raising their voices, they took control of a helicopter and ordered the pilot to fly low and silent. Minutes later, the aircraft touched down on the roof of Grasse Prison. Armed men descended, moved through service corridors, and in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee, Pascal Payet was in the cabin, the rotors lifting him into open sky again. By the time the prison even declared an emergency, he was gone. News outlets exploded. "He did it again," blared one headline. The Ministry of Justice promised a reckoning. Borders were tightened. Interpol got involved. But Payet had vanished, and for 2 months he remained a ghost, until Spanish police kicked in the door of a quiet apartment in Mataró. There he was, calm, unarmed, and perhaps a little amused at the sight of the officers who had finally caught up. This time, France didn't just lock the door, they welded it shut. Maximum restrictions, undisclosed location, 0 contact with the outside world. Years passed without another escape attempt. But the legend of Pascal Payet wasn't finished. For the first time in decades, the walls seemed to hold him. Gone were the constant transfers from one high-security block to another, replaced by a cold, deliberate stillness. Pascal Payet had become less of a prisoner and more of a specimen, observed, studied, and kept under conditions so strict they bordered on sensory deprivation. No cellmates, no casual interactions, and minimal exercise time. Even his mail was filtered with surgical precision. He was a man suspended in a glass box, visible but untouchable, a trophy in the government's display case of problems solved. Yet confinement was not the same as defeat. Behind the reinforced doors and the layers of surveillance, his mind was still working. He read obsessively, books, case files, anything that could keep his thoughts moving. Guards reported that he rarely showed anger. If anything, he was unsettlingly calm, as though he had accepted his fate, which in itself made them uneasy. They knew his history. Acceptance wasn't his nature. The French justice system, however, had no intention of offering him another opportunity to embarrass them. His reputation wasn't just about daring escapes, it was about exposing vulnerabilities. Every time he slipped past their defenses, it wasn't just a failure of security, it was a public humiliation. After the Bastille Day incident in 2007, the political fallout had been so severe that entire careers inside the Ministry of Justice had ended prematurely. No one wanted to be the name on the report if he ever got out again. The years crawled by in that calculated isolation. Then came 2019, and with it, a decision that few could have predicted. After serving nearly 12 years since his last capture, Payet was quietly granted parole. It wasn't freedom in the romantic sense, far from it. His release came shackled with strict conditions, regular check-ins, curfews, travel restrictions, and constant monitoring. The decision stunned many, but to those who had studied his case closely, it was a calculated risk. He was now in his mid-50s, his health no longer at its peak, and years of isolation had dulled his immediate threat level. Perhaps some thought the legend had finally burned itself out. For a time, it seemed, they were right. He kept to himself, living quietly and away from the kind of noise that had once surrounded him. The tabloids, once eager to splash his face across their covers, moved on to fresher scandals. His name stopped trending in headlines, and the narrative shifted to other crises. But silence from a man like Payet is rarely permanent. It's usually the pause before another move. September 2020 broke that silence. The details at first were murky. A Parisian businessman claimed he had been approached by men who demanded an eye-watering sum, 400,000 euros. This wasn't a random stick-up, it was extortion, calculated and chilling. The man reported that the threat was clear: pay or face the consequences. When police began to untangle the threads, a familiar name surfaced. Phone data, surveillance footage, and the victim's own account pointed in the same direction. Pascal Payet had made direct contact. The conversation, captured in audio, was devoid of theatrics. No shouting, no drawn-out intimidation, just cold, clipped words that left no doubt about the danger behind them. Investigators moved with precision. They had learned over the years that letting Payet linger too long outside a cell was an invitation for trouble. On November 24, 2020, they struck. Coordinated teams swept through multiple locations, pulling in several individuals, including Payet himself. Unlike his legendary arrests of the past, there was no chase this time. No weapons drawn, no last-minute escapes through rooftops or side streets. He went quietly, perhaps knowing there was little point in resisting. He was still on parole when the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The charges were severe: attempted extortion backed by organized criminal involvement, and the evidence was more than enough to stick. Over the next 2 years, the case wound its way through the French court system. Prosecutors built their argument piece by piece, intercepted calls, traced movements, and testimony from the businessman who had been targeted. Payet's defense tried to paint the case as circumstantial, a web of associations and assumptions, but the threads were too tightly woven. On May 25, 2023, the verdict came. Standing in the courtroom, a man now 59 years old, he listened as the judge delivered the sentence: 5 years in prison. There was no visible reaction, no smile, no frown. If he felt anything, he hid it well. The gavel fell, and once again, the state had him. The story might have ended there, a quiet fade into the grey years of a man who had already lived more than one life in the shadows. But the thing about Pascal Payet is that he was never just a man, he was a symbol. And symbols, once burned into the public imagination, are hard to erase. The French prison system didn't take chances this time. They placed him back under conditions so restrictive they bordered on the inhuman. His exact location was undisclosed to the public, and even to some within law enforcement. The idea was simple: if no one knew where he was, no one could break him out. The echoes of his past were still too loud, the embarrassment of his previous escapes still too fresh in institutional memory. For Payet, the walls had always been a temporary inconvenience, but now the game was different. The men he had once run jobs with were gone, some dead, some locked up, others retired into obscurity. The criminal networks he had leaned on had shifted, fractured, or vanished entirely under the weight of modern surveillance. Technology, once his silent ally, had evolved into an omnipresent threat, tracking movements, communications, even spending habits. The world outside had changed while he was locked away, and the old routes, the old tricks no longer existed in the same way. Yet his name still carried weight. Inside certain circles, his story was recounted with a kind of awe. The man who had made helicopters his ladders, the man who had humiliated the most secure prisons in France 3 times over. Young inmates, too young to remember his escapes firsthand, still traded stories about him in hushed tones. They speculated on what he might be thinking, what he might be planning, whether the legend would ever step into daylight again. The guards, however, saw a different reality. They saw an aging man with eyes that still measured every detail of his environment. They saw the way he studied people without seeming to, the way he tracked time without ever looking at a clock. It was as if he carried the blueprints of every building he had ever been in inside his head. And they knew that if opportunity knocked, just once, it would be enough. Years in isolation had stripped away many things: freedom, contact, even the illusion of control. But it had not touched his capacity to wait. And if there was one thing Pascal Payet had always been willing to do, it was wait for the perfect moment. The years ticked by, and the man once called France's greatest escape artist became a ghost in plain sight. Officially, he was just another inmate serving out the tail end of a long sentence. Unofficially, every door that closed behind him was reinforced by the weight of his legend. His presence was a living reminder of the prison system's most public embarrassments, and that reminder came with a price. No guard ever relaxed around him. No protocol was ever taken lightly in his vicinity. If others could afford to get lazy, no one guarding Pascal Payet could. And yet, in that relentless surveillance, something began to shift. The eyes on him weren't as fresh as they once were. People rotated in and out. Some of the guards who had lived through the panic of 2007 had long since retired. Younger staffers, briefed only by reports, had never felt the real sting of watching him vanish into the sky. To them, he was history. A dangerous man, yes, but an aging one. His record read like folklore, not like a living threat. Inside his cell, Payet noticed, he always noticed. The weight of years had slowed his stride but sharpened his instincts. He knew that complacency, even in small doses, was the first step toward a crack in the system. And cracks, no matter how hairline, could be split wide open with enough pressure. What no one realized was that while the world assumed he was cut off from the criminal network that had once served him, the network itself was changing. It wasn't the same old crew, too many of them were gone, but crime had a way of filling its own vacancies. There were younger faces now, hungry to make their mark, to prove themselves to the man whose name had been whispered like a badge of honor. These weren't the street-level opportunists of the 90s. These were operators born in the digital age, blending hacking skills with street muscle, connected in ways old guard authorities still struggled to anticipate. Whispers started surfacing among the inmates. Odd little changes. Someone in the laundry unit noticed a civilian delivery van lingering too long outside the outer fence. A staffer in the control room caught a fleeting blip on the radar, logged as a technical anomaly. It all disappeared into reports no one had the energy to chase. But to Payet, patterns were everything. and these anomalies weren't noise, they were signals. By early spring of the following year, the tension inside the prison seemed to thicken, though most couldn't put a finger on why. Payet's behavior was unchanged on the surface, quiet, orderly, the model prisoner. But the guards who'd been there long enough recognized the faint shift in his eyes, the way they sometimes stayed locked on the smallest details, the way he occasionally paused in mid-step, as if running calculations in his head. Then came the morning. Clear skies, unusually warm for the season. The prison's routine unfolded without incident. Breakfast trays rolled down the corridors, staff rotated through checkpoints, and the control room scanned the usual list of visitors and deliveries. Just another day in a fortress designed to keep the world out and one man in. At 10:14 a.m. the first sound was mistaken for wind. By 10:15 the hum deepened, mechanical, rhythmic. Guards on the outer wall turned their faces upward, squinting against the sunlight. The hum became a roar. It happened faster than anyone could process. Over the western wing where Payet's unit was housed, the shadow of a large aircraft swept across the yard. Not a small tourist chopper this time, but a matte black helicopter built for speed and stability, its windows dark, its rotors thundering. It dropped hard and low, slicing the air with a violence that sent dust and debris whipping into the faces of stunned guards. Before the sirens could even start, two figures in tactical gear were on the roof, cutting through the service hatch with a portable torch. The breach was precise, no wasted movement, no scrambling. Inside the solitary wing, Payet was already at his door, standing perfectly still, as if he had been waiting for a knock. The guards who tried to intercept never had a chance. Flash-bang grenades detonated in the corridor, white light swallowing the space, ears ringing. In that disorienting blur, the intruders moved like shadows, reaching Payet's cell and snapping the lock in seconds. He stepped forward without hesitation, eyes fixed ahead, not sparing a glance at the chaos behind him. They retraced their path to the roof. The moment they emerged into the sunlight, the helicopter's engine screamed to full throttle. Payet climbed aboard, the rotors spinning into a blur. The prison below erupted, sirens, shouting, the desperate scramble of officers trying to reach positions they would never make in time. The aircraft lifted, banked hard to the south, and was gone. The entire operation had taken less than 3 minutes. In the control tower, staff scrambled to lock on to the target, but the helicopter vanished off radar almost immediately. It had been equipped with signal jammers, and whatever route it took was masked by the surrounding hills. No one could say where it went, only that it was gone. By the time national alerts went out, the internet was already flooded with grainy cell phone footage from nearby towns. Clips of a black helicopter skimming rooftops, hugging the tree line, disappearing into the horizon. Social media feeds exploded. Headlines broke across Europe. He's out again. What made it different this time wasn't just the audacity, it was the precision. It felt less like a daring gamble and more like the execution of a plan years in the making. That night, a video surfaced on an encrypted channel used by organized crime groups. No one knew who uploaded it. The footage was low-lit, the sound of rotor blades faint in the background. A man stepped into frame, face shadowed, but unmistakable in posture and presence. His voice was calm, steady, and carried the same quiet authority that had once orchestrated escapes from inside locked cells. "They thought the game was over," he said. "It hasn't even started." The clip ended abruptly. Within hours, it was being shared in corners of the internet, where his name was spoken like a challenge. In police briefings, senior officers stared at the still frame of that shadowed face, knowing what it meant. In the Ministry of Justice, phones rang through the night. Somewhere beyond the reach of their searchlights, Pascal Payet was free again. And this time, it wasn't just an escape. It was a declaration.